Jesus Christ, is she still talking? What is she even going on about? Theodore Teddy Oliver nodded at his date across the table. Amina Mabumba continued to speak. He was not quite sure what he was nodding in response to. He had been preoccupied with his meal.
Red blood spilled upon white wool, and the black flies gathered. Their wings twitched, and their many eyes watched as Arthur stooped lower for the corpse of the lamb. Its eyes were as glass. So I'm going to start with the obvious, really easy sort of question, which is why worms specifically?
Is that an easy question?
I thought it was easy for me.
Fair enough. I feel like worms in and of themselves have like a creepy quality to them. Like the fact that you can cut them in half and both halves can squirm away. There's just something that's intrinsically eerie about a worm, and I wanted to integrate that into a horror story, especially with the variety of worms that are out there. I thought that it would be a lot of fun to see how many types of worms I could creep out the reader with.
You've also got that aspect of worms are often associated with like death and the grave, which you use in the story quite well.
So I would ask you the same question. Why did you go in the direction you went in? I'm trying not to spoil the creature in your story, because it's one of the most interesting creatures I've ever read about in horror.
It's tricky as well to answer the question without spoiling the story. I can say bees, can't I? That's not too much of a spoiler. Yeah, I think bees in part because you do have cases of bees sort of creating hives or nests in carcasses, which I think is sort of a nicely horror, sort of gothic, macabre image of you've got these things living inside something dead. And then I sort of combine that with thinking about kind of concepts of like death and sort of immortality and forms of that, where it's just like when creatures die or people die, they sort of get reused by the environment. Almost immortality, but not, not with the living forever part. What inspired you?
What inspires me is people's behavior and how people treat each other. So while your story is more of a supernatural story, mine has supernatural elements, but it starts with human interaction. And that's what always fascinates me, just seeing how poorly people can treat each other and not even blink an eye or not even care about how they're affecting others, how their behavior makes other people feel. So I always like to explore that in horror, because if you ask people about their horror stories, most of the things that people are horrified by are just the terrible interactions that they've had with other people.
That's very true. I never actually thought about that, but you're right that if you ask someone for a horror story, they're less likely to tell you about like a supernatural, sort of semi-supernatural encounter or something really creepy they saw, and more likely to be like, there was this really awful woman in the shop the other day.
Exactly, right? So I feel like writing about like human monsters is just something that people can really relate to. So that's what I gravitate towards with my writing.
So what is horror to you?
I feel like horror can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. Like our stories are both horror, but they're two very different stories, right? So whereas some people might think horror is more blood and gore and undead things, I feel like horror is anything that makes you unsettled, anything that makes you pause and think about what could go wrong next.
Yeah, I think that's a very good answer. I think that it is one of those cases of it's, you know it when you see it, but it's very hard to pin down exactly what horror is, because I think in a lot of ways it's multiple overlapping genres.
I agree.
That there's not, say, a huge amount of overlap between like a gothic story and a slasher movie directly, but you can find things that are sort of somewhere along that spectrum, and so broadly they all become horror. I think that I would agree that horror is basically just anything kind of unsettling. Yeah, I think it's a very broad, very flexible genre.
I agree, and I feel like there are other genres that could be included in the horror genre, but I also understand that people like to disassociate with horror. Like you find a lot of readers that kind of look down on horror,
Yeah.
and I'm not going to say they don't understand horror because that sounds sort of like dickish. But what I'm trying to say is that they have a preconceived notion of horror that isn't inclusive to other things.
I definitely agree. I mean, personally, I've written multiple stories that I've kind of been, I'll write it and then at the end I'm just like, is this fantasy? Is this horror? Or like, is this sci-fi or is this horror?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm the same way in terms of I write I say that I'm a dark fiction author, right? I don't limit myself to saying that I'm a horror author, and that's just because sometimes when I'm writing a story, I have no idea what it is until it's finished. Like you said, you reflect, and it's like, oh, this is this is that, or sometimes it's a mishmash of a lot of things, right? And that's why I just like to go under the category of dark fiction because it allows me room to breathe.